Good morning. My name is Maike Sheep, and I'm an international student advisor working with scholarship recipients. I'm a member of the LCIC planning committee because I was an international student myself back in the day and know how important career and networking events are for international students in particular, as it is so easy to get overwhelmed by the Canadian labor market. This morning, I will be your host and moderator. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, Launch a Career in Canada presents Diversity and Inclusion in Careers with Cicely Blain. Launch a Career in Canada is UBC's annual networking experience dedicated to supporting the career development of UBC international students. Each year, Launch a Career in Canada provides opportunity for UBC international students to connect with alumni who were once international students and learn from their experience establishing their careers. As we speak of establishing our lives in school and work settings located in the land that we call Canada, it is of great importance that we also acknowledge where we are today. On these territories, the work we do, the path we take, the education we pursue, these are all taking place on Indigenous land. UBC Vancouver is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, and I am currently living and working on a traditional and ancestral territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, which lies within the shared territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Katzie, Musqueam, Kekwat, Squamish, and Stola First Nations. I would also like to encourage all of you to take a moment to remember whose land you're currently residing on. Before I introduce our fantastic facilitator for today to you, please let us know where you're here by clicking on the link that Monica just posted in the chat. And Cicely, would you mind going to the next slide? Yes, so there is a QR code here that you can use, and the link that Monica just posted in the chat. The passcode is 1234. So please click on it and let us know that you're here this morning. All right, I will now be introducing you to Cicely. Cicely Blain is a diversity and inclusion consultant, activist, and writer. They are one of Vancouver's 50 most influential people of 2018, as awarded by Vancouver Magazine for their work as a co-founder of Black Lives Matter, Vancouver, Canada's second Black Lives Matter chapter. They were also a winner of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Youth Leadership Award in Social Movement Building for their commitment to Black liberation and LGBTQ activism. Cicely Bell runs Backhow Consulting, a social justice-informed diversity and inclusion consulting company with over 100 clients across North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, including the United Nations, the City of Vancouver, and multitude of influential businesses, institutions, and municipalities and NGOs. Cicely Bell work is informed by their professional and academic background as an international student at UBC and their life experience as a queer artist, community builder, and intersectional feminist, and a Black liberation activist. So with these words, I'm going to hand it over to Cicely now.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Very excited to be here with you this morning. As mentioned, my name's Cicely Blain. I'm originally from the UK, but I came to Canada, came to UBC as a ILOT scholar in 2012 and have been here ever since. So yeah, today I'm really excited to take you through this conversation about diversity and inclusion, particularly in a workplace context. A lot of Canadian companies are really moving towards diversity and inclusion and trying to acknowledge and honor the different lived experiences that people have. So with my company, I help a lot of Vancouver-based organizations, but also other organizations across Canada, and even we have clients in the US, parts of West Africa, Asia, and other places as well. So it's a pretty exciting industry to be in right now, to see how many changes are being made, how people are really looking to create more inclusive and equitable environments. So hopefully some of what you'll learn today are things that you can take with you into the workplace. So I also just want to offer my own acknowledgement, which is that my work and my team's work takes place on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish nations, especially as I do diversity and inclusion and anti-racism work. A lot of that is deeply informed by the teachings and ideas of specifically Indigenous communities. So I want to offer that before I begin. So I also just want to share our goals for today's session, and also our goals more broadly when we're excuse me, when we're engaging in diversity and inclusion content. So firstly, attention to detail is a really important part of this process. So we'll be looking not only at systemic oppression and how that functions in the larger society that we live in here in Canada, but also in a global context, but we'll also be looking at how those things can show up within a workplace, and how those things can inform the power dynamics that might happen in a workplace. So paying attention to that detail is really a crucial element to gain that DEI lens for looking at this work. I also always remind people to accept and expect non-closure. So we won't cover everything today. Of course, this is a lifelong journey to truly understanding what it means to create a diverse and inclusive working environment. And so it's okay to feel unresolved and leave with further questions. In fact, I hope you do leave with further questions and continue these conversations with your peers, with your family, and with your future employers, as you move into the workplace. Right to pass, basically, I just always offer that, you can engage in this session however you feel comfortable. You can use the chat function to let me know any questions. I'll be looking out for that. And also we'll have a moment for discussion later on in the session as well. But you always have the right to pass and don't have to participate. And then finally, just a reminder that we're here today to challenge concepts, not people. So sometimes it is necessary to challenge an individual. But today, when we're talking about sort of an introduction to DEI, what I want us to consider is that we're all at different stages of our learning journey, and our lived experiences of racism or sexism or homophobia, or all of these things that can make someone's experience challenging are different, right? And everybody's at a different place in that journey. So we're challenging those issues rather than individuals. So as I said, those are sort of how I invite us to engage in today's session, but also more broadly engaging in DI with these values. So there's lots of different people doing work like the work that I do, lots of different DEI consultants. A lot of companies and organizations now actually have their own internal DEI teams or sort of managers, which is really cool to see that change of how so many organizations are taking DEI more seriously, that now it's like an actual sort of embedded role within a company or within an organization. So what you might see is sort of different perspectives or different ideas or different values when it comes to DEI. So I just want to start off by sharing what's the lens that I come into this work with, and what values my company sort of strives to bring into the DEI sort of sphere. So for me, this can all be summarized by the fact that I think DEI is about creating space for everyone to be their full self. I think that all of us are unique individuals, and sometimes when we show up in a classroom or in a work environment, we have to hide or sacrifice or put away parts of us that make us who we are, right? Whether that's your sexual orientation, whether that's things that are sacred to you in your culture. Maybe you've been made to feel othered or different because of the type of food you eat, or the clothes you wear, or the accent you have. Or who you're in a relationship with, or how much money you have, right? We've all had those moments where we were made to feel different or othered. So what we'd want to try to create in the modern workplace is a space for everyone to feel uninhibited, right? To feel like they can show up in the truth of who they are. So to achieve that, there's 3 values that I bring into this work. Firstly, anti-oppression. So this is the recognition that, unfortunately, we live already in a lot of unfair structures and systems, right? There's already existing inequity around the world and even here in Canada, meaning that there might be unconscious bias in hiring practices, there might be disparities in wealth, there might be higher rates of violence or discrimination towards certain communities. And before we can focus on the workplace, we have to focus on those larger societal issues, right? Because when we go to work, we're not going to work completely devoid of our relationship to society. We're going to work actually deeply connected to everything that we do, right? To our parents, to the media, all of these things. So anti-oppression is a way at looking at the harm that might have been caused by these structures, and actually an organization and the people in that organization making a commitment to undo those structural problems, to decolonize those structural issues, and rework things in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone. The second value really links to this idea of people being able to be their full selves. So recognizing each person's sense of self, their humanity, honoring the individual needs that they have, and recognizing specific histories of trauma or oppression or hardship they may have faced. But also on the positive side as well, recognizing the uniqueness that each person brings, rather than homogenizing or lumping everybody together or expecting that everybody can thrive in the same environment, right? We all have unique needs rather than we all have the same needs. And then finally, justice is about establishing initiatives and processes that are rooted in fairness and enable us to bridge gaps and balance inequities. So what this means, for example, is oftentimes, workplaces will have some kind of policy in place, like an anti-bullying policy or an anti-harassment and discrimination policy. But typically the consequences of stepping out of line, or the consequences of doing something wrong, can be pretty extreme. So this idea of justice actually allows us to remain connected to one another and be accountable to the ways we might harm each other, and actually continue to learn and grow, right? Like if, for example, if somebody harms another person, like verbally, for example, in the workplace, and we immediately fire them, they're probably not going to learn from that situation. They're probably just going to get another job and continue to behave in that same way. If we take a restorative justice lens and we invite that person to sit down with the person that they harmed and have a conversation, a mediated conversation, they'll actually learn how they hurt that person and will have the opportunity to apologize, be accountable, and actually change their actions in the future. So that's why justice is an important lens here. So I like to summarize this as, we often think about the golden rule, which is to treat others how you want to be treated, right? I'm sure many of you have heard that sort of age-old saying. But I actually prefer to think of the platinum rule, which is to treat others how they want to be treated. And I think this is really important because we're all different, right? We all have different needs. We all come from different religious, economic, cultural, gender backgrounds, and have varied experiences of how we want to be treated. And so an inclusive workplace is one that acknowledges these differences and provides people with what they need to thrive, rather than trying to provide everybody with exactly the same thing, right? Because if I say, I need coffee in the morning to thrive, but the company says we only give everyone tea, I'm not feeling valued by that, right? I'm not being given what I need to thrive in that environment. So for me, this can be summarized with this quote by Brené Brown. So what she says is, if the culture in our school, organization, place of worship, or even family requires armor because of issues like racism, classism, sexism, or any manifestation of fear-based leadership, we can't expect wholehearted engagement. Likewise, when our organization rewards armoring behaviors like blaming, shaming, cynicism, perfectionism, and emotional stoicism, we can't expect innovative work. You can't fully grow and contribute behind armor. It takes a massive amount of energy just to carry it around. Sometimes it takes all of our energy. So for me, what Brené Brown is saying here is, when we work in an uncomfortable or toxic or harmful working environment, this can become a really overwhelming experience, right? Where we then find it difficult to do our work, right? Like if we think about, okay, let's take, for example, we're in a workplace or even in a classroom where there's this environment of blaming and shaming and cynicism. What impact does that have on the people in that environment? So yeah, please use the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute themselves to share a response to that. What kind of, how can that make someone feel if they're constantly in this environment of blaming, shaming, this kind of toxic environment, and they're trying to get their work done? How might they respond or behave or feel as a result of that? So I'll give folks a couple of moments if you want to put your answers in the chat, or if anybody wants to share. Yeah, unwilling or afraid to ask for help or feedback. Yeah, totally. Right. So you might, if there's this kind of environment of fear, you're probably not going to want to speak up, right? Even if you're struggling, even if you don't know what to do, you're probably just going to try to sort of put your head down and get on with things, right? Yeah, exhaustion, absolutely. So it's tiring to constantly come up against maybe a leader or even a professor or excuse me, or a manager who's leading from a place of fear rather than from a place of inclusion or respect. Any other thoughts? How else might you feel? Yeah, self-doubt, absolutely. So if you're in this place where you're constantly being critiqued or shut down, you're going to start to question your own abilities, right? You might have that sense of imposter syndrome where even though you know that you're qualified for the role, you might start to question that and think, should I contribute? Is my work good? Am I worthy? Right? So these pretty negative feelings can come as a result of an exclusive environment. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, gaslighting, wondering if it's all in your head. Totally. So you could absolutely feel like, am I imagining this? Like, is this just me? And I think an environment like this also creates a lot of fear among the employees or the participants, right? So they're less likely to confer with others and more likely to feel like they're the only one having this experience. Whereas it's quite likely other people resonate and are feeling the same thing. And who might be most likely to be impacted by an environment like this? Brene Brown talks about that wearing the armor all the time. What kind of people might be most likely to be always wearing that armor? Yeah, those who are minorities in their field, absolutely. So for example, if you're in a male-dominated industry and you're a woman, you're probably more likely to be the target of discrimination or at least feel like you don't belong or feel that sense of doubt. Yeah, absolutely. Any other ideas? Yeah, people who are new to their field of work, absolutely, right? So if you are, if you don't know how to sort of play the game, if you don't know how things work in that organization, or even in the Canadian labor market more generally, you might be wearing that armor. Yeah, shy people who are introverted, right? Less likely to speak up. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, thanks for those responses. Yeah, queer and trans people, Black and Indigenous people, right? Folks who are experiencing, if we go back to that big picture systemic lens, right? Folks who are marginalized structurally and systemically by living in, the society that we unfortunately have inherited, right? Absolutely. People who are either ethnic minorities or gender minorities and have been excuse me, have been marginalized over time are more likely to, feel like the sort of victims of a lot of this, harmful and and toxic workplace behavior. Yeah, thanks for sharing those. So that's really important to consider is, of course, this quote kind of mainly focuses on leadership. But I do think it's important to consider that leadership does not necessarily mean that that one figure who's right at the top. It can, of course, and it does very much mean that one leader. But leadership is also a relationship to power, and all of us have power in different ways. And we'll talk more about that later. But when we think about what we want to avoid when we're going into a workplace is we want to avoid experiencing this, but also we want to avoid being complicit in this, right? If we enter into a working environment and this is the pre-existing environment, in order to survive, it can often become quite easy to conform to this existing environment and be complicit in harming others in that process, especially if you're someone who has maybe more social privilege in other parts of your life. And we'll talk more about what I mean by that in a moment. But before we do that, I want to break down some of the language that we're using today. So probably what you'll see is, as I said, there's lots of different consultants and people in the DEI world. So I just want to kind of break down that language because there's a lot of language that's kind of used maybe interchangeably. And I think we should, just take a moment to unpack that. So this is an illustration by a consultant named Chris Burnett. And what she illustrates here is the importance of these three sort of concepts that we're talking about today, diversity, inclusion, and equity, coming together to create this central environment of belonging. And how important it is that we can't just have one and we can't just have two. We must use all three of these values and initiatives as one to come together to create this central environment of belonging. So I think that's something, that all of us desire to some extent, right? Is to feel like we belong, right? That enables us to thrive, to feel connected, to feel like our views and ideas are being taken seriously and integrated. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you love everything about your job, or it doesn't mean that your job takes over your entire life, but it does mean that I think, a lot of us, especially if you've trained, you've gone through university to get this career, you want to feel that sense of value in the workplace, right? So what she shows here is, for example, if you have inclusion and diversity, so you've got lots of different identities, which is pretty common in a Canadian workplace, especially in a larger city like Vancouver, Toronto, you would already have some level of diversity, right? So it comes kind of naturally. Then you have inclusion, which means the thoughts, ideas, and perspectives of all the individuals matter. Now, if you have those two, but you don't have equity, so equity is the constant recognition and redistribution of power. If you don't have equity, what can happen is the dominant group is often deferred to for decision-making or promotions or new opportunities. So for example, you might have a diverse workplace, but then what you will see as you look at the leadership, that leadership will be significantly less diverse than the rest of the organization. So you might see a lot of men in positions of leadership, you might see a lot of white people, white men in positions of leadership, and people of color, especially women of color, in lower positions or entry-level positions. So that's what happens when we don't have equity. So we've got the diversity, but there's no redistribution of that power. Similarly, when you have inclusion and equity, but you don't have diversity, of course, you get an oversaturation of similarity, right? Lots of people who are the same or similar, coming from one or two cultural backgrounds. You don't get those new, interesting, and innovative ideas from people with different lived experiences. So what we're going to do today is focus a lot more on equity because, especially in Canada, there has been a lot of progress made when it comes to inclusion. Especially here in BC, we have one of the most thorough human rights codes in the world, lots of there's lots of designations that are protected, you know, your race, not only your gender identity, but also your gender presentation, your sexual orientation, your religion, so on and so forth. We're very protected when it comes to our rights in the workplace. So not to say that diversity and inclusion are like done and finished, there's still work to be done, but I think equity is where we need to focus our attention, is how are we sort of evening those playing fields and redistributing power in a way that allows for more voices to appear in different places. So let's talk more about that. So you might be familiar with this comic. I think it's been around for a while. And it shows us here the difference between equality and equity. So based on what you already know, or based on looking at this diagram, would anybody be able to explain to us what's the main difference between equality and equity? So you can use the chat, or if anybody wants to share out loud as well. What's the difference between equality and equity?
Equality means when you are distributing the same amount of resources among people, and equity is need-based, when you are distributing according to the need the person requires.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for that explanation. Yeah, so equality, giving everybody exactly the same thing, which, as you can see here, doesn't actually help all of the people, right? Yeah, I see in the chat here, equity makes room for different lived experiences. Absolutely. So equity is needs-based, is giving people the tools that they need to succeed, in this case, to see over the fence, right? To participate. Now, there's some additions to this diagram. The unfortunate reality is that things, especially when it comes to wealth, for example, are a little bit more skewed. But then we also have this version, which shows us liberation. And liberation really speaks to the removal of structural and systemic barriers. Now, obviously a lot easier said than done. We're still on this process. You know, there's still many activists fighting, and change makers and policy makers fighting to remove systemic barriers, to remove that fence. And many fences have been removed, especially in Canada. But there's still some ways to go. And so I see equity as a stepping stone to that eventual goal. It's kind of a process that helps us get closer to that goal of liberation. So we have this version, you know, it's similar, but it's different. Can anyone explain what's different about this version of the comic, and why might this one be a little bit more realistic as a representation of how things function in the real world? So this is the first one, and then the second one. Yeah, systemic barriers don't affect everyone the same way. Absolutely. What else do we see? How's that being illustrated in this diagram? So we can see here that not only, yeah, sloping fence and uneven ground, absolutely. Yeah, and the systemic barriers even help some people while harming others. Yeah, great point. So we can see absolutely that the ground is uneven, and also the barriers that people are coming up against can be more extreme for some. And so I think this is a good representation of, or a closer representation of reality, because if we look at the first version, what we see here is the smallest person cannot see over the fence, and we could make the mistake of assuming they cannot see over the fence because they are short, and we could blame them. We could say, you can't see over the fence because you are deficient, or you're not good enough, or you're just not trying hard enough. And I think that's something that sometimes we do, right? We blame particular communities. That community doesn't work hard enough, that community's lazy, that community isn't as intelligent, or that community doesn't try, right? I think we hear that message quite a lot when we're talking about why can some people, why are there disparities, why are there inequities? And sometimes we make the mistake of blaming the people rather than blaming the structural issues that might be holding a community back. And we also see here the person in yellow is looking through a crack in the fence. What could this be a metaphor for? Looking through a crack in the fence. What might that mean? Yeah, it could mean getting by, maybe breaking a hole to try to get access, right? Sometimes we criminalize communities by saying, they're more prone to violence, or they're more prone to crime. If you're in Vancouver and you go to the downtown east side, you'll see a lot of police cars circling that area. Is that because those people are necessarily inherently more prone to crime? Not necessarily. It's because they're being criminalized for the ways that they're trying to survive, right? So we might see someone as breaking a fence as being a vandal or being a bad person. Why don't they try a different way to overcome the systemic issues? Rather than realizing that maybe they've been held back from participating in society by the existence of the structural barriers in the first place. We could also maybe see this as a token gesture of access, right? So a lot of our, world problems could be solved by the 1% redistributing their, access to wealth and resources. But instead, what happens oftentimes is we set up charities, or, financial aid, or, development projects in parts of the world. And these are kind of these small token gestures that allow people to get ahead a little bit, but don't actually change the overarching structures that are existing as barriers to them, right? So lots of ways we could interpret that. So yeah, I think that's interesting. An important way to start is thinking about a lot of this has to do with power and our own access to power. So one more concept I want to touch on before we kind of apply all of our learning today into more. So what I'd like us to do, we're going to do a quick activity. And you should, let me see. If you go to the participants tab, you should see a little function that allows you to raise your hand. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to be bringing a list of names up onto the screen. And you're going to start the activity with your hand raised, your virtual hand, or you can do your real hand wherever you are. And as soon as you see a name that you don't recognize anymore, you're going to put your hand down and you're going to keep it down. So either you can just do this, privately wherever you are, or you can use that virtual hand to signify that your hand is up or down. Great, I see some hands up, awesome. So yeah, if you just click on participants, I believe, I think it might be different on a Mac. Maybe it's by the chat. I'll give you a couple of seconds to find that. Okay, so yeah, what you're gonna do, okay, yeah, Mac, you go to reactions. Yeah, so basically what you're doing is you're starting with your hand raised. Again, could be your virtual hand or your real hand. As soon as you see a name come up on the screen, so I'm making a list of names, you're gonna put your hand down and you're gonna keep it down for the rest of the activity, okay? It's not a test or anything. Don't worry if you get it, if you're confused. And then we'll unpack that afterwards, okay? So you're starting with your hand up, put it down and keep it down as soon as you see a name you don't recognize. Okay, so let's go. George Floyd, Eric Garner, Mike Brown, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, Jazzaline Ware, Malaysia Booker, Rakia Boyd, Shanique Proctor, Tanisha Anderson. Okay, so I saw a few hands as we were at the beginning, but then by the time we got to the end, everybody's hand was down. At what point did you notice yourself putting your hand down, or at what point did you stop recognizing names? Yeah, so maybe the beginning of the second list. Yeah, which side did we notice more names of, and why might that be? What do you think is the distinction between these two lists? Yeah, gender, right? So we've got two lists here. Does anybody recognize overall where these names come from? Who are these people? Yeah. All of these people are victims of police violence, right? So they have been killed at the hands of police. So these are all Black people. Now, the difference, as you noticed, is that the first list are all men and the second list are all women. In fact, the majority of them are transgender women. So what we see here is, yes, all of these people share the same experience, that they're Black, they're American, and have been harmed by police or by some kind of racist violence. But for some reason, we knew a lot more of the male names, right? We recognized a lot more of those names. Those names show up more on social media, on mainstream media. Those names have had their, those people had their stories reported. Maybe those people, not all of them, in fact, quite a few of them, but some of those people got justice for what happened to them, right? The second list, many of us don't know those names. Many of us don't know those people, don't know what happened, their story, their life. And the key distinction there is their gender. Even though there's many similarities, the key difference why these people's stories are not known to us is their gender. So this activity is inspired by Kimberly Crenshaw. Does anybody know what term Kimberly Crenshaw is known for creating? What concept did Kimberly Crenshaw come up with? Yeah, intersectionality, right. So intersectionality, just a dictionary definition here, is a concept that is often used in critical theories to describe the ways in which oppressive institutions are interconnected and cannot be examined separately from one another. So let's unpack that a bit more. So Kimberly Crenshaw, she's a lawyer, and oh, sorry, just having a technical difficulty. Give me 1 second. It's coming back. Okay. Yeah, so Kimberly Crenshaw is a lawyer, and in 1989, she wrote a paper in which she coined this term, intersectionality. And what she spoke about in that paper was the experience of a young Black woman who took her employer to court because she felt she had experienced discrimination in the workplace. Now, she lost the case because the employer could prove that there was they had a program and what do they call it? Affirmative action program for Black people, for African Americans. And they also had another program which was supposed to advance the experiences of women in this organization. So they claimed, and the reason they won the case is because as a Black woman, she should have benefited from both of these processes, right? A process for Black people, a process for women. But when Kimberly Crenshaw investigated and looked into those initiatives, who do you think actually benefited from those processes? Who benefited from the process for African Americans, and who benefited from the process for women? What do you think she found, and why this Black woman had not benefited from either? Any ideas? Who benefited from the process for African Americans, and who benefited from the process for women? What kind of people? Yeah, absolutely. Black men and white women. Every single person who, had, been a successful candidate for their affirmative action process for African Americans was a man. And every single person who had benefited from their, women's employment process was white. So actually, rather than benefiting from both initiatives, this woman had benefited from neither. So let's illustrate this a little bit more. Whether it's a social movement or, an initiative in the workplace, if these two things are distinctly separate, there will always be people who fall between the cracks in the middle. So intersectionality, as Kimberly Crenshaw describes it, is when we make sure that these two processes are entirely overlapping. And so that's really important when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. You often see, okay, so for example, it was recently Black History Month. So if we were to look at that from an intersectional perspective, we would make sure that those who are Black, but also women and queer people and people with disabilities and working class people are also benefiting from that, right? Or, say, now it's Women's History Month. How do we make sure that we're not just centering women who have more privilege, right? Not just white, straight women. How can we make sure that women of color, Indigenous women, women with disabilities, queer and trans women are also being embraced by that process and valued, right? So if we go back to those names we just saw, that's an example of intersectionality, where those people who were Black transgender women, they weren't just experiencing racism, they were also experiencing sexism and transphobia. So the way those forms of oppression compounded made their lived experience and also their death much more intense or much more severe, right? So that's what intersectionality is about, is ensuring that we don't basically fall into the same patterns where we continue to privilege a certain group, even within a marginalized group, if that makes sense, right? For example, the right to vote. If you were to ask someone, when did women get the right to vote in Canada or the US, most people would say, the early 20th century, around, the time of World War I. But when you actually look at which women got the right to vote, it was a very small group of women. It was white British or French women who were married, who were over the age of 30, and their husbands had to own property. So that actually cut out a pretty distinctive part of the population. Indigenous people in Canada didn't get the right to vote until 1960. So that's not really intersectional, right? When we say women got the right to vote, it was not all women. It's not until, the 70s that we can say that all women have the right to vote, right? So, and then of course that doesn't include people who, don't have citizenship, people who are incarcerated, so on and so forth. So that's just one way to kind of think about this, is these issues are never happening by themselves. Okay, so when we talk about intersectionality, we were talking about overlapping forms of oppression. But wherever there's oppression, there's also privilege. And privilege, we all have it to some extent, some more than others. Some people's privilege is more weighted. So you might have you know, if you have more wealth privilege, that can get you a lot more opportunities in life. Gender privilege, racial privilege can allow you to you know, traverse society or you know, overcome systemic barriers in different ways. But when it comes to, you know, our relationships in the workplace, how we interact with one another, why is it important that we talk about privilege in today's conversation? So why should we talk about privilege in our own experiences and when we're talking about diversity and inclusion? Any ideas? Why should we talk about privilege? Yeah, it can help prevent biases, absolutely. It's helpful to think of privilege kind of like a bit of a bubble, right? We're all born into our own experiences, and until we meet other people or travel the world or, you know, expose ourselves to other ideas, it can be a bit of a bubble in which maybe we don't understand how other people experience life. Yeah, so it can help us. We learn more about our own privileges, we can develop more empathy for others and hopefully prevent bias. Yeah. Any other reasons why we should unpack our privilege to create a more inclusive working environment? Yeah, to recognize that uneven playing field, right? So instead of assuming that everybody can achieve the same thing, you know, like when I moved here to Canada, you know, I was an immigrant, but of course I'm an immigrant from the United Kingdom, which is very, very different from somebody who's immigrating from, you know, a country that's not a Western country or not part of the Commonwealth, or, you know, doesn't have a history of colonialism. So I did not have that empathy or understanding of how other immigrant experiences were a lot more challenging than my own. Recognizing so when I say unpack, what I mean is, like, how can we really recognize what our privileges are, and actually, like, lay those out on the table. So for example, I can, you know, give a personal example. My privileges are, you know, being British, for example, speaking English as a first language, being middle class, having a university degree. So if we're all able to, like, have open conversations about what our privileges are, that allows us to recognize more about each other, but more about ourselves too. Yes, to be open and accepting individual differences among people. Totally. Yeah, so lots of great answers there. Yeah, totally. If we don't acknowledge our own privilege, we might believe that everyone shares our experiences. Absolutely. And so therefore we don't see the ways others are harmed simply by living in this society. Yeah. And so this is such a great point that, you know, unless we are all actively participating in, you know, uplifting or supporting others or trying to be, you know, we don't all have that much power. You know, as individuals, we can't make huge changes. But I do think with privilege comes a responsibility, right, to uplift others. As you know, as soon as you know, I come from a, you know, pretty poor area of Southeast London, and my goal has always been, with the privilege that I have now, this opportunity to get an education and earn more money and grow my career. I have always wanted to go back and help uplift others, right? So that is, I think, a responsibility that comes with that privilege. Yeah, so lots of reasons. Understanding power dynamics as well, right? So remember earlier on I talked about power, equity and power are closely connected. Equity is about that redistribution of power, and that power can look different, right? That power can be, yes, it can be traditional, like, you know, being the boss or being the dean or being a professor or whatever it is. That's a type of power. But what about that kind of unspoken power that we might have because of our privileges, right? The power that I have as, yeah, you know, as somebody with with a British passport, for example, you know, when I'm traveling with my friend, I was traveling with a friend who has a South African passport, and just the hoops that she had to jump through. And I realized how I could just, you know, so casually talk to the border, you know, the border control person in a way that she couldn't, right? So that's power, the power that I had in that moment, the power I had to change something. Understanding how you experience different things from how other people experience them. So oftentimes people with a lot of privilege think that the world is great or the world works well because it works well for them. And they can become complacent in not recognizing how it doesn't work well for everyone, right? And that's why, especially in the workplace, you might come up against people who are resistant to diversity and inclusion. You might come up against people who are saying, you know, what's the point of all of this? What's the point of us talking about diversity and inclusion? Like, everything's fine. You know, we live in Canada. It's a very progressive place. Why do we need to focus on, you know, inclusive language? Well, this is the reason, right? Because there are still many people struggling or, you know, facing unconscious biases or experiencing microaggressions. But those with more power don't necessarily see that. So we need to learn our own privileges so we can open our eyes to other experiences. Recognizing history is important, right? You know, living here in Canada, we live in what is called a settler colonial country, which means Europeans colonized these lands and are still here, right? Some countries experienced a different kind of colonialism where the colonizers left. I mean, that doesn't mean it's any better or worse. It just means we as those who are living here, who are not Indigenous, need to recognize how we might be complicit in the continued settlement of these lands. So that's one way we can think about how those histories of injustice have shaped the society that we live in. Reflecting on the complexities of our identity, also reflecting on how privilege can change and shift based on our age, our location, our job, right? So if you get a promotion, you have more privilege than you did before, or maybe wherever you are in the world, people see you or treat you differently, which could give you more or less privilege. Opening your eyes to how you may have been unintentionally biased towards others, and to help you grow as an ally to people from different backgrounds, right? So I mentioned before that privilege is a responsibility. And so where you see yourself as having privilege, you can act in a position of allyship to help others. So what we're going to do now is we're going to do a quick activity that invites you to reflect on your own experiences. So if we go back to our idea of intersectionality, and we think of intersectionality as being all of the different ways that our identities are overlapping, and our identities in relation to systemic oppression are intersecting and overlapping. Now, obviously, this is non-exhaustive. We have more identities than what I've written here, but PowerPoint would only let me have this many categories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up some questions onto the screen. The questions are going to invite you to reflect on these different parts of who you are. And then after that, we're actually going to go into breakout rooms. I know we're a small group, so maybe let's just do 2 breakout rooms. And you're just going to have a bit of time to chat and unpack these questions and how they land for you. So let me bring up those questions, and then we'll jump into those breakout rooms. So, have you ever been called a racial slur? Are people who look like you stereotyped to be dangerous or lazy? Does your gender match the one on your birth certificate? How often do you get asked if you want children? How long can you remain in Canada? Do you have a passport? Can you hold your partner's hand in public and feel no fear of judgment? Have you seen many intimate scenes that represent your sexual orientation in movies? Have you ever worried if there will be an elevator at an event? Did mainstream schooling suit your learning style? Have you ever had your abilities questioned because of your age? Do people ever speak loudly and slowly to you? Did you go to university? Have you ever worried about where your next meal is coming from? Have you always felt like your dreams were achievable? So when you're in the breakout rooms, you won't be able to see the slide anymore. So either take a picture or maybe just take a note of something that kind of, stood out to you in these questions, made you think. Any volunteers?
Yes, I'll go.
Okay.
In my breakout room, we talked a bit about accents, and how accents can be used to discredit just what you're saying, and how accents from different regions have different effects on your credibility. Because I'm Mexican, I have an accent, but I think it's hard to like pinpoint where it's from. So I've never felt, and it's a light accent, I think. So I've never felt discriminated or like what I'm saying loses value because of my accent. But the person that I was talking to had the opposite experience. So I think accents, especially here in Vancouver, are like a big, a big barrier, I think.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that leads us on to our next discussion nicely. I see anecdotes about how complaints often fall on deaf ears at university. Yeah, totally. That's a great point, is that individually, we're all doing the work to try to have empathy and compassion for one another, but then comes the issue of sort of coming up against those structural barriers, right? Those systems that are not necessarily designed to be completely supportive. And when you're moving into, a workplace, I think it depends on, of course, depends on the organization. But I think it's really helpful to kind of like know your rights within the workplace, also know, what policies they have, what processes they have. I do a lot of work with clients, kind of, we do like an audit process for our clients where we're like analyzing how well they're doing or how not well they're doing with diversity and inclusion. And almost always the issues are that people don't know how to report an incident, or to report, even if it seems small, even if it's something, just a comment here or there. A lot of people would prefer to stay quiet about that because they don't have trust that the organization or the leaders will take their problem seriously. So that's definitely something to consider. And I think a lot is changing. A lot of organizations are doing much better. But that's a really important thing when you first get into an organization, is to ask them, what's your commitment to diversity and inclusion, right? How can I make the most of my time here and ensure that I'm feeling valued and respected? How can I report an issue if something happens to me? How can I know that issue will be taken seriously? And those are kind of small ways we can make a little bit of change, or at least, get a little bit of security for ourselves as we enter into a new space. Okay, so we're going to switch gears a little bit now, and we're going to talk about unconscious bias. So unconscious bias is a weird one because it's pretty unavoidable. We all have unconscious biases. They're sort of a natural part of who we are as human beings. They're deeply embedded in our brains, and mostly for a good reason. Unconscious biases are designed to keep us safe, because they help us to make quick cognitive decisions. So it starts off with a heuristic, which are generally those sort of mental shortcuts that ease the load of making a decision. So for example, if you're thirsty, you would know that you need to have a drink, right? So that's a mental shortcut. You don't actually have to think about that process. It just makes sense. A cognitive bias then is a tendency or inclination towards or against something. So if you're thirsty, you need a drink, your bias would say probably water is a better drink than, I don't know, vodka, if you're thirsty, right? So that's that cognitive shortcut that's saying one thing is better than another. Now, as I'm sure you can imagine, when we start to develop these cognitive biases about other people or places or cultures, or accents, or just ways of being, that can really become a problem, right? And all of us, as I say, have these unconscious biases because of where we were raised, what our parents told us, what we watched on TV growing up, what was in our textbooks. We've all got some cognitive biases, and not all of them are bad. Again, the purpose really is about quick decision making. It's about personal safety. It's about protecting ourselves and those who are like us. But as I'm sure you can imagine, when it comes to something like hiring or making a decision, that's when a bias can kind of get in the way and become problematic. So a lot of biases are often based on a stereotype, so based on kind of a homogenous sort of identity that has been created about a person or a group of people. So for example, all people of one race are like this, or all people of one gender behave like this, which we know is not true, because you can't homogenize an entire group of people. Yes, of course, communities have similarities, but for the most part, we're all unique and different. But the problem is this can lead to exclusion and discrimination when we start to assume everybody of one background is the same as each other. And that's what creates those cognitive biases. Oh, those people are bad drivers, I'm going to avoid that area of town. Or, those people are more dangerous, I'm going to avoid them, so on and so forth. It can lead to very negative associations. So if unconscious bias goes unchecked in a workplace, it can lead to a narrow pool of people who are being hired and promoted. This can hinder creativity, diversity, and inclusion in a workplace. And overall, it stunts innovation, productivity, and growth. So the problem with, when an organization or a company lacks diversity, what they're doing is essentially closing themselves off to new ideas, to new ways of doing things, to exciting ideas, so on and so forth. But the problem is a lot of companies don't realize this. I think a lot are growing and a lot is developing, especially over the past year when there's been a lot more awareness and attention to D&I, and a lot more awareness and attention to anti-racism and Black Lives Matter, all of those things. I think things are changing and transforming. But there can still be existing biases that might be challenging to overcome in that initial conversation. So let's touch on those types of bias. There's something like over 100 types of bias. So obviously we're not going to go into all of them, but I wanted to share a couple. Affinity bias leads us to favor people who are like us. So say that, you're in an interview, if the interviewer might feel more affinity to those who are similar to them. So it's not always negative. For example, it actually can be used as a way to create a deeper connection with someone. Say, for example, this person says, oh, I like soccer, and you say you like soccer too. This is a way to build that sense of connection with someone, especially in that initial interview process. And maybe later on down the line, you might have heard that some companies have what are called ERGs, which stands for Employee Resource Groups. And these are actually intentionally founded around affinity, right? So they're on purpose. People, you might have like a women's ERG or an LGBTQ ERG or, Indigenous employees ERG. And it essentially means that those employees come together to have a safe space where they can connect with one another. So it's actually affinity bias being used in a positive way. And that's something I think is really cool that a lot of Canadian workplaces are doing. And hopefully you'll have the opportunity to participate in those. And if not, you can suggest them, right? You can ask to form your own ERG, and lots of companies have the budget for that. Some of the best clients I have, they have like really cool opportunities for their ERGs. They bring in guest speakers, they provide food, and it's all on paid staff time. So I think that's a really cool way that you can connect with others who are like you in the workplace, especially if you're feeling isolated, or you're feeling like not many other people understand your experience, or you feel like you're a minority. that opportunity to connect with others can be really powerful. We then have the confirmation bias, which leads us to always search for or interpret information that confirms our preconceptions. So what our brains are trying to do, again, as a cognitive shortcut to make something easier, is look for something that we think is true. So people might be making judgments about us based on, well, I mean, people definitely are making judgments about us on those. That's why they say first impressions matter so much, right? Is because a lot of that first impression really sticks in someone's mind. So for example, if someone turns up early, it means they're good with deadlines. Now, it could mean that, but it's not guaranteed, right? But the more that you're able to show these positive characteristics and skills in that initial conversation, the more that can be interpreted in that person's mind as you being a positive influence on the workplace. Similarly, we have the halo effect, which means we translate one good thing about a person to mean that they will succeed in many other areas. So for example, if someone is good at public speaking, we might think that they're a good leader, which again could be true, but it could also mean that we don't consider maybe quieter or introverted people to be in leadership positions. So this is a place where you might need to advocate for yourself, because a lot of people already have these preconceived biases, and might, you know, if you're someone who's interested in pursuing leadership, but you're maybe quieter or more soft-spoken, or, you know, not necessarily like super, you know, charismatic and outgoing, but leadership is something that interests you, you know, you have to be aware of these potential biases that people might have, and convince them of your abilities in other ways. You know, a good leader also needs to be decisive and firm and confident, and kind and fair as well, right? These are other leadership qualities. And then we have the Cloven-Hoof effect, which means we generalize one negative trait to someone's whole personality. So again, this links back to how impressions can make a difference. There might be pre-existing stereotypes about clothing or style in that people might have these preconceived ideas of somebody's you know, ability to contribute to the workplace based on how they appear in the first interview, which overall a lot of these biases can be judgmental. And in my work, what I try to do is train clients to try to avoid these biases, right? To deconstruct these biases, kind of how we unpacked our privilege, right? We can also unpack our biases. And so, yeah, I think this is work that's really changing in a lot of Canadian workplaces, as people are much more committed to de-biasing and to letting go of some of those biases that are deeply held within us. So this brings me to the next point, which is microaggressions. So microaggressions are sort of connected to bias and informed by bias. They are subtle, insidious aggressions that are either intentional or unintentional. They can be reoccurring, but they can make somebody feel dismissed or isolated or small or excluded. So these are things that come up a lot in workplaces, because they often happen as a result of stress. So if we're in this moment of heightened stress, we often rely very heavily on our biases. So the reason I use the iceberg model to illustrate microaggressions is because we have things that exist sort of above the waterline, things that we know are wrong, things that, you know, we know that we shouldn't do in a workplace. Then we have some things which kind of exist on the waterline, some things that mostly we know are inappropriate but can still happen, or maybe we'll laugh it off, kind of go unspoken. But then I'm just going to bring up a whole load of them here for us to consider around all of these microaggressions, small things that can happen that could communicate to somebody that they are less important, or that they're not valuable, or that their voice doesn't matter. And the thing with microaggressions is they are reoccurring, right? They're reoccurring and they accumulate. So for someone to say that once, it's like annoying, but it's not the end of the world. If you keep hearing that same question or that same comment over and over again, it can become really overwhelming and harmful. So let's pause here. Are there any here that I've got on the screen that you'd like me to clarify or don't understand what they mean? Yeah, so dead naming refers to referring to someone, usually, excuse me, usually a transgender person who's changed their name, and so referring to them by the name that they used before. Obviously, sometimes it's an accident, it's a mistake, but sometimes people also do that, as a ways to cause harm to that person. So if somebody, says, hey, I've changed my name now to fit with my gender, and then you refer to them by the name that they used before, that's dead naming. Any other questions? Yeah, tokenism. So tokenism is essentially seeing someone, especially if they're a minority, maybe they're the only person of X identity in the workplace, maybe the only Black person or the only transgender person or whatever it might be. And you have particular expectations of that person. So you might ask that person to speak on behalf of their entire community. You might say, it's Black History Month, what should we do to celebrate? Which is not necessarily bad, but if that person's not being paid to do that, and they're being expected to do all of these additional tasks simply because of their identity, that can become kind of problematic. So that's kind of what tokenism is. It's like having one person represent their entire, racial or cultural group. So telling someone they're in the wrong bathroom. So again, this is usually something that happens to transgender people. We might make an assumption about who belongs in which bathroom, and we might say, you don't look like a woman, so you're not allowed to use this bathroom, things like that. That could be a microaggression. And gaslighting is when we kind of make somebody feel like they're imagining it, basically, like they have made up their experience. So for example, if I say to, my boss, I feel like I've experienced racism, and they say, oh no, I don't think so. Like, I think you're just imagining that, or I think you're overreacting, or that kind of stuff doesn't happen here. That's gaslighting, right? Making somebody feel like they're losing their mind, making someone feel like they're imagining what's happened to them. And it's something to be quite aware of, especially in the workplace, because oftentimes, companies or organizations might want to protect themselves, to protect the image of the company, or they might get defensive. And so, it's important to kind of stand your ground and recognize that your truth is what you experience, right? Yeah. So those are microaggressions. Of course, there's so many more, and we could spend more time on that. But just things to be mindful of. Both, you might be on the receiving end, but you could also be complicit in using some of these microaggressions towards others. And if we go back to that first quote by Brené Brown, she talks about that kind of overwhelming environment, that need to wear armor, right? If you're in a workplace where there's lots of these microaggressions, you might need to be wearing that armor. So it's important to be mindful of, the language you're using towards other people, the things you say. Even if it seems small, it could still really hurt someone. Okay, and so that brings us to the last part of today's session, which is thinking about how do we build trust with other people. So a lot of this has to do with trust, right? Oftentimes when we encounter people who are different from us, our instinctual reaction is to not trust them. Now that might seem strange, because it's very unconscious. It's a deeply rooted unconscious bias. It's not necessarily saying like, oh, I meet somebody of a different race, I automatically don't trust them. That's not what I mean. What I mean is our deeper subconscious is more likely to trust people who we connect with, who we see as similar to us. And again, that's not always a bad thing. Finding people that you connect with is important. But sometimes in a workplace, what this can mean is if other people have experiences of discrimination or harassment and they try to share that with you, especially if you are in a position of leadership, sometimes we don't know how to help them, or we don't provide the best support because that layer of trust is missing. So sometimes what can happen when somebody comes forward and, you know, says that they've experienced harm, or even if they're directly addressing you and they're saying, you know, last week you said something to me that, you know, came across as homophobic, or last week you said something to me that I felt was sexist, right? Our initial reaction is often to be reactive, defensive, presumptive, and deflective. And that's coming from a place of fear and shame. Again, if we go back to our Brene Brown quote, that's coming from a place of fear where suddenly we're being called out, right? We're being questioned. We're being asked to reflect on how we might have done something wrong. And that's a lot to handle. And that can really make people feel, that can activate a lot of stress in people. So what we need to do is, you know, at any time in your life, you could be on the receiving end of harm, but you could also be complicit in causing harm to others because of biases you didn't even know that you had. So we want to try to avoid these defensive reactions, right? We want to, you know, if somebody comes to us and says, you know, you caused me harm, we want to respond in a way that's accountable and empathetic and kind, which is difficult to do because we're kind of being put on the defensive, right? We feel the need to defend ourselves, to speak up for ourselves. But let's think about a way we could do that differently. So for example, what we can do if, say, somebody comes up to us and says, you know, I experienced XYZ, whether it was me who did it or somebody else who did it, how can we respond to that person so that they feel valued? Firstly, we can mirror their language, body, and tone. So if someone's saying, oh, this has been really difficult, we can mirror that. We can say, yeah, I totally see how hard that's been. Even if you don't necessarily understand right away, because of course you won't necessarily understand someone's experience if it's different from yours. But there's ways that we can help people to feel like they matter. Naming the type of oppression. So I think this is really important, is if we're able to give a name to something, it becomes more real, right? So that can avoid that gaslighting. If someone says, you know, so-and-so called me this slur, you can say, oh, that sounds like it was racist, or that sounds like it was homophobic. And we can also refer back to our BC Human Rights Code or, you know, whatever workplace policy exists, and say, actually, that's not okay. We need to do something about this. And then finally, validating. It's not your fault. You deserve better. I'm happy to be listening to you right now. And so we could say these things to other people, but we could also say them to ourselves, right? We could also engage in a process of self-validation as well, right? Sometimes when we experience harm, we internalize them. We feel like we are to blame, that we are causing people to treat us in a particular way. But it's important to offer ourselves that gratitude and offer ourselves that compassion as well. So the last thing I want to share is just talking a bit more about allyship. So an ally is someone who recognizes and affirms the struggle. So say, you know, I consider myself an ally to the Indigenous community. So I know that I'm not Indigenous, but I see the experiences that they go through. And I try to keep learning and do my best to, you know, be involved in you know, if Indigenous activists are, you know, asking for money or asking for resources, I try to do what I can. But we can also think about an advocate. So an advocate is someone who lobbies and advocates on behalf of a group. So for example, if you see that somebody, you know, in your workplace is not having a good time, is being interrupted a lot, is being talked over, is being dismissed, is being, you know, all of those microaggressions. As an advocate, what you can do is step in and say, hey, I noticed that so-and-so was making a really good point, but somebody interrupted them. Can we go back and listen to what they were saying? Or, you know, I noticed that so-and-so hasn't had a chance to speak this whole meeting. Can we give them some time? So that's a way that you can be an advocate. And then finally, we have an accomplice. So this is someone who consistently stands in solidarity with the group and puts their body on the line. So this could look like literally, like it could mean going to a protest and, you know, putting yourself in a position to protect others. Obviously, that's not necessarily available, especially if you don't have Canadian citizenship, for example. You know, you might be putting yourself at more risk. But I think as you grow in your career, as you become a leader, as you have more access to privilege and financial safety, you can start to become an accomplice. So recognizing that, you know, sometimes you need to set boundaries or say no or speak up to a bully in order to change the environment for everyone. So those are just some other ways we can think about allyship. Beyond just recognizing someone's experience, allyship has to be a bit more active. So that actually brings me to the end of our session. I always like to just share a couple of reading suggestions before closing up, because there's lots of great books out there. My favorite one is actually that one at the bottom there. It's called Not My Idea. It's actually a children's book, but I think it's really powerful because it reminds us that we learn a lot of bad biases and bad stereotypes as we grow up. But we also learn that we don't have to support all of those bad messages, right? So there's a lot of personal work we need to do to check our own biases so that when we enter into a space, we're not bringing those biases with us. So yeah, that brings me to the end of the session. Thank you so much for participating. And I'm happy to stay for some questions, but I'll hand it back over to Micah to close this up.
Great. Thank you so much, Cicely. This was wonderful. We'll definitely see if we have some questions, but before that, it would be great if you could let us know what you have learned. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Monica, for posting the link. So please click on that link and let us know what you have learned, or scan the QR code. Yeah, I'll hand it over to Cicely to see if there's any more questions from this very engaging and thought-provoking workshop. This is so great.